All right, hello everyone. The timer in Discord says the time's up, so I think that means we ought to be starting. My name is Joona. I'll be your chair for this round. First of all, congratulations for everyone for making it this far. There is some information regarding consent that you can see on the stream, on the screen, I mean. Please take a look and act accordingly if you are speaking in this round. In order to check that everyone is here and get any preferred pronouns or anything else, any other introductions that people may have, would firstly the panel wish to introduce themselves?
Hi everyone, my name is Lior, and his pronunciation, and wish you all good luck.
Jack, no preference.
Hadar, please.
Sarah Shiode, please.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then to go to the teams, opening government.
Daniela speaking first, no preference.
And Isabelle speaking second, she, her, please.
Thank you very much. And opening up. Do we have opening up present here?
Silke, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't know I was muted. Silke, no preference.
Harmen speaking second, no preference.
Thank you very much. Closing gov.
Galymzhan speaking first, Hiode.
Kanat speaking second, no preference.
Thank you very much. And closing up.
Julia, do extension, they, them pronouns, please.
And Cveta, she, her, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. Finally, a note in terms of timing. As far as I'm aware, we have no time signals given by anyone in this debate, so please time yourselves, but also time others, so you know when you're allowed to ask POIs to keep some kind of order in this debate. Presuming that there are no further questions at this stage, without further ado, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate. Hear.
Cool, can everyone hear me? I will take that as a yes. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, a few things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to give some framing and talk about why developed countries are uniquely poised to do this and why it is better that it's the government that does this and not privatized companies. Second of all, I'm going to talk about investment and why that's ultimately a good thing, especially into research and development. Please mute yourselves. And finally, I'm going to talk about why it's better that we just develop an escape hatch to Mars while we can and while we still have the time. But first on framing. So why do I think that developed countries are uniquely poised to engage in this research and to fund this? 4 reasons why. First of all, they probably just have a lot more money, right? Like if you're a developed country, your citizens are probably pretty wealthy. You probably collect a significant amount of tax revenue from them. You probably have a lot of money that you can utilize to spend on this. You probably have a lot of reserves and the capacity to build up some level of debt, right? Second of all, we think that you probably just have more individuals that are educated at a high level. If you're a developed country, you probably have institutions. You probably have like institutions that have been around for a while, things like universities that can educate people at a pretty high level. You probably have a lot of people who can who are clever enough to like make quick advances in spatial technology. In spatial technology, and we think that you probably have the best facilities in order to do this. Third of all, we think that there's just probably fewer needs in your country, right? Like if you're a developed country, you're probably pretty economically stable. Like the average amount of money that individuals in your country make is probably pretty high. You probably have like some level of social safety net. You probably just don't have needs in your country that you need to meet, right? Like there's probably not things on earth that you need to be investing in. Fourth of all, you probably just have pre-existing facilities at the point at which most developed countries in the world have engaged in some form of space exploration. And we think that it's a lot easier for you to build off the facilities that you already have in the status quo in order to continue exploring space. What do we think this investment looks like? We think it looks like giving grants out to scientists. We think it looks like creating more NASA-like bodies that facilitate and centralize space exploration. We think it looks like building more facilities to facilitate spatial exploration, building more rocket ships, building more things like that. Finally, why we think it's better that the government does this in private companies. So we think that like individual governments probably collaborate with other countries probably better than companies like SpaceX or like whatever Virgin's doing, right? Like we think that because it's not for profit, there's no competitive incentive to be better than the other country and things like that. We think because you're not really trying to draw profit. It's really just more public investment for the public good, right? Like we think we think you're likely to like share research with each other, compare notes. We think you're likely to make a lot further strides. Note that countries collaborate a lot in space in the status quo. And you're probably just not going to start a war over space because wars are costly. We think that it's likely that you collaborate with other countries. We think it is better that you do so because it means that because when you're sharing your research, when you're building on other countries' research, and when every single country is channeling like their intellectual elite into this goal of exploring space, we think that it's likely that you will just make further advancements at a quicker amount of time. Second of all, on investment. Okay, so we think that there's probably a lot of research that goes into adapting to an entirely new place and climate and setting and everything, right? Like there's like space is entirely different from like everything in space is entirely different from Earth in like the amount of oxygen you have, in being able to like bring food and water up, figuring out like what supplies will keep if you bring them into space, right? Like we think that there's a lot of research that goes into this. We think that generally the research institutions that tend to get set up around space are pretty sustainable. They're pretty long term. They probably get grants that last for a while because it's acknowledged that space exploration takes a while. It is acknowledged that it takes like at least a few years to build a rocket ship, let alone get into space. Note that a lot of space projects like the Mars rover have been in space for like for decades now. We think that this means that there's going to be a lot of long-term research that occurs that is not dependent on like individual grants or individual goals. Like we think that a lot of this research is likely to happen over the long term. Why do we think this is good? We think that like unrelated to simply advancing in space, you probably develop a lot of like technological externalities, right? Like you probably develop technology that can be utilized and applied to other things that occur on Earth. Note that a lot of inventions that happened in the world are built off of research that was originally done for space. It's probably things that you probably wouldn't expect, things like you probably weren't thinking of until you were thinking, how do we adapt living to like an entirely new place or climate? Why do we think this is good? First off, we think that probably just creates more jobs. We think it probably like gives more money to researchers, gives more money to researchers. There's also probably manufacturers that have to build these new inventions, and that probably creates some amount of jobs within the economy. Which is just generally good for people who get those jobs. Second of all, we think that it's probably just genuinely useful research, right? Like at the point at which you're investing in a lot of medical research in order to figure out how to keep people from dying in space and how to keep people breathing in space, you probably invent a lot of things and like look into the human body in new ways. This looks like things like oxygen tanks getting invented in the 60s. 60s are used not only in space to like keep people breathing, but also used now in hospitals to save lives. We also think it just looks like nice little novelties like nonstick pans that everybody likes. Okay, second of all, Mars and why it's good that we have an escape hatch. Before I'll do that, I'll take CO.
Wouldn't you agree that even if it is a developed country, there are probably more pressing concerns both within the country and in terms of foreign aid that this country could spend money on besides space exploration?
Yeah, okay, so I think that there's probably this leads pretty well into my second point. I think that there's probably, I think that like of all the issues that countries face, climate change is probably the single most pressing issue that every single nation faces, right? Like the climate crisis is reaching a point of no return. Most scientists agree that in like a matter of a few decades, in less than 100 years, Earth is probably going to be uninhabitable. We see that this is starting to happen now. There's natural disasters occurring at an alarming rate, things like hurricanes, things like forest fires in California, things like earthquakes, things like countries and states starting to go underwater. We think that ultimately, since Earth is becoming uninhabitable, we have to start thinking about what our other options are. We think that the only option is really just to move planets at the point at which Earth is becoming uninhabitable, and like any change that we can cause is probably a stopgap measure. Note that like it's hard for the government to pass carbon tax legislation or things like that because people generally assume like subsidizing saving the environment is like a bad thing because most people just don't believe in climate change. However, note that space is probably an easy sell. If there's no economic crisis, space is generally seen as like a nonpartisan, all around good that creates like a national identity. Even if it's unlikely that climate change is going to happen, which we think that it's probably likely it will happen, you will have to move to Mars at some point. We think that it's good that you at least have an escape hatch in the country. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for those fine remarks. I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition here.
All right, am I audible? Great. Then I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'd like to go into the answer of OG on the POI of CO, where they talk about how Earth is getting inhabitable, because that's exactly the point that we want to make. What we see is a climate disaster taking place and that the resources of the Earth are getting scarcer. And this means that it's important to take action because, as climate activists say, there's no planet B. That's one of the most used catchphrases at a climate protest. And this might sound like I'm making a guff case, right? But the point is that it will create a narrative that the consequences of fucking up the Earth will be minimal because we can just leave to another planet, right? If we burn up Earth, if we use up all of Earth's natural resources, if there are too many disasters taking place, and we just go to Mars, and if the same thing happens there, then we'll just go to Venus and so on and so on. But we think it's principally wrong to burn up all the planets because it just makes people dive away from responsibility, and we need to take care of the Earth, the planet that we're living on right now. Secondly, I'd like to stress that all the developments that need to be made in order to make another planet habitable. Even if you think that we don't have this responsibility to keep our own planet habitable, this technology to make other planets habitable will not be developed on time. Because we're talking about if we don't take any action on climate change, we were talking about maybe 10, 20 years, and it won't be enough time to ensure that the atmosphere of Mars is habitable for the people. And people might say that this is not mutually exclusive, but the money for this will come from the money that goes to science, which is super important for fighting climate change, right? We need to think of different ways to transport people, to produce food, to do any other thing that is currently destroying our planet, and finding a solution for that. And she agrees with us that it's important to breathe and be sustainable, as they were mentioning. So yeah, I think that we can stress the importance of climate change and fresh air, and of not fucking up our Earth. And what I'd also like to stress is that there are other priorities that we need to spend money on, like, for example, the climate change that I mentioned already, but also like healthcare and education, for example, because we see this in, for example, the current COVID crisis. We need to develop an expensive vaccine. We need to help people who lose their jobs. And that's just an example of how a very real life situation can make it very necessary for governments to spend money on those vital areas, because without healthcare, people can literally be dying right away. And without education, we would have a massive decrease of job loss, and we'd also be unable to develop this technology that we need to battle climate change. So we also think that the education ensures the jobs that OG is talking about and is trying to ensure through a space program. So we agree with the point, of course, that jobs are very important. But we think that we could also spend more money in healthcare and create jobs there, for example, or create jobs while creating sustainable new entrepreneurships or new sustainable ways. Ajit, yes, I'll take your POI.
Okay, so it's possible that you could spend that money on like welfare or healthcare or whatever. Why is it likely that that's going to happen?
Okay, it's likely that that's going to happen because we see that those two things are very, very vital in keeping society going. And we see that if it's necessary, the more necessity there is to spend that money on those areas, it happens. If we see for example, I'm from the Netherlands, and our government is putting a lot of extra money into healthcare currently, for example. Not as much as I'd like to, but they are putting a bit of extra money into healthcare, and they're especially putting extra money in helping people who lost their job through the COVID crisis. So because if they don't do that, then the society will criticize them, assuming that, you know, this developed country is a democracy, and they'll just be voted out of office, and that's something they don't want. And a lot of politicians, I hope, are also in place to help the people of the country they're currently leading, and those are very vital things. So if those things aren't ensured well enough through the government, they'll face massive backlash from society, and I think therefore it's very likely to happen. We think it's important to stimulate saving the Earth and invest in climate measurements instead of investing in space exploration. And we think that it would create a narrative that we don't simply have one planet, so we don't need to take care as much about it. And there are also practical implications, namely that it is not a solution, even though the image that it is a solution will be created, because we are not as far with the technology yet, and we will not be able to develop this technology before action should have been taken. And the COVID crisis shows that there are other priorities, but also the COVID crisis is just one example of a situation that triggers governments to invest in way more vital areas like healthcare and education, and we need the money that the government is currently having for those kind of things, and we don't think that we need it necessarily extra for space exploration. Thank you for listening to my speech.
I thank the speaker very much for those final remarks, and like then invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Okay, am I audible? Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about what we hear out of opening opposition. Okay, so because I just think that it's untrue. I just don't think they give us any structural reasons why it's likely that you can get this money diverted away from things like science, from things like space exploration, into things that that are historically underfunded, that politicians don't care about, like healthcare systems, like climate change. Okay, first of all, why do we not get any structural change on the point about climate change? Like, sure, it's bad. Sure, climate change is bad. I just think that it's probably just because like huge industries like oil are literally contingent on climate change happening and continuing, because the people who own those companies are incredibly wealthy and are willing to lobby politicians in almost every country to make sure that there aren't carbon taxes on whatever they produce, to make sure that they're able to keep producing whatever they want, to make sure that they're able to do whatever they want. Means it's just unlikely that you're ever able to get actually efficient regulation against climate change. I think we've seen this because we've kind of known about the effects of climate change for 30 to 40 years already. We've seen very little in the way of enthusiastic reform for any of the practices that oil companies actually have. I think also this point about healthcare, yeah, sure, healthcare is important. I just think that because the majority of governments in the developed world are controlled and are mostly made up of politicians who are pretty elite, who are pretty rich, who don't care about ordinary people's welfare and are not interested in strengthening social welfare systems. I think that also that it's just not usually a voting issue for people. People aren't likely to disown a government because they don't have a strong healthcare system, because people don't want to believe that they'll get sick, and people don't want to have to think about the fact that they're going to have to access public healthcare at some point. I think what that means is that there's just no structure, there's no incentives for governments to ever invest in these things. I think coronavirus hasn't shown us that we're able to invest in healthcare. I think it's shown us that we just haven't invested in healthcare in almost any developed country in the past 10 or 20 years. I think it's just shown us that the healthcare systems aren't very good, and I don't think it's given us particular incentives to make them better structurally over the long term, rather than just providing emergency accommodations or extra emergency beds for people because it's a pandemic or whatever. Okay, then I just think this point about climate research just not being very efficacious, I think that's just not really how research works. It's not the case that some research is just, no, I'll take a POI later. I think it's not the case that some research is less efficacious or more difficult than others. Sure, it might be true that there isn't a huge amount of research into space currently. That is because there isn't a huge amount of investment. That's because there aren't a lot of private companies who are working on it, and the private companies that work on it spend a lot of money and don't publish their research because they don't want anybody else to use it, because they're trying to profit off of it. That's why we don't see anything about space research. At the point at which you start systematically creating structures and employing people and deciding to make long-term research projects about something, that's the point at which you do see research results. And even I don't know, I'm unsure about why you're able to claim analysis that it's just slower than other forms of research. No, it isn't. It just hasn't gotten invested in it since, it just hasn't gotten any investment since the 80s. But I think that like comparatively, climate change research, while it is done comparatively more than space research, and we think that we know more about the planet we live on than like other planets because like we've lived here and we've been researching it for longer, it's also just useless at the point at which you're not willing to use any of it. Like there's a significant amount of people both in politics and who like and voting people who just don't think that like that climate change is real. They think that it's caused by other external factors to us, that it's not caused by humans, and therefore find it very, very easy to disregard research. And comparatively, it's just impossible to disregard. Like the way that you interact with like space research is completely different when it's government funded, when governments are able to share that internationally. Like I think that like, yeah, sure, space research is like, sure, like space research is like is lacking currently, but I think at the point at which that is because it's concentrated in like one or two companies that don't publish research, as opposed to what we're able to do when you make this a national project, or you make it where multiple governments are investing in this, where they're able to share research internationally because it's in their best interest to do that, because some countries are better able to research things than others. Like when the US is able to collaborate with like the telescopes that are in Europe, you're likely to get research faster than like just Elon Musk doing research by himself. At that point, because governments are able to like leverage diplomatic and international ties that they've developed in through other mechanisms like their trading partners or diplomatic ties that they have otherwise, that's the point at which you're able to get research significantly faster, and it's also likely to be more collaborative than it would be if it's just simply done by private companies, because this research is done, and this, like on both sides of the house, this research is still done. It's a question of who is doing it, because it's a question of who is doing it. Because I think it's probably just worse to leave it completely up to private corporations who are able to keep their research private, or not able to share it with, who are not willing or are not mandated to share it with anybody, or give anybody else access to the kind of technology they invent, which is going to enable them to like ship rich people off to Mars, and rich people who have probably contributed the most to like structures of oppression that enable things like climate change to happen and to go unchecked. It's probably just not good that those companies are able. It's probably just not good that those companies are able to sit on that research and not use it, because I think that people are likely to just stand behind. I think that like at the point at which you nationalize space research, you make it part of a national identity. That's the point at which people think that is like something that is cool, or something that is tied to like a national identity, something to be proud of, because people are like excited by space research because everybody believes that planets exist and people don't believe that climate change is real. That's the point at which it's probably just better to get people behind that project, to get people behind that national project, and they're likely to kind of be okay with the governments investing in it, since they see that the governments aren't investing with anybody else. I'll take a PY from closing.
So you say that people don't care about their healthcare. Does this mean that the public healthcare system is going to be gutted to make money for this? Or can you provide more clarity specifically on where this money is coming from?
I'm sorry, I don't have to draw out every country's individual budget in order to say that our mechanism works. Like, I think that it is probably reasonable to fiat that, like, I don't know, we just don't fund, like, okay, first of all, Daniela already told you that companies are able, like, that states are able to accrue debt in ways and not think necessarily about how they're going to pay that back in the short term. But also, normally research is diverted from other, like, research to do things that are academic is normally not diverted away from healthcare, because that doesn't make any sense. Also, like I think it's probably just more likely it gets directed from like climate change. It probably just gets directed from like climate change research or whatever. I also just don't think that really matters, because I think it's just like, it's probably unlikely we're going to like gut the healthcare system, because it's probably just really annoying and difficult to do. Also, it's a pandemic. I think like that's kind of like largely outside of the debate, but I think that you should stand. I think that you should stand with opening government, because we actually tell you that it's probably just better to have to kind of like get research out there that's actually useful, that you're able to like use internationally. It's actually going to work. It's actually going to save people's lives, rather than continuing to push climate change research that it's very easy to ignore, that people don't necessarily care about, because it's very easy to, because there's people in power and politics who tell you that you're able to ignore it. Thank you, and I beg you to propose.
I thank the speaker for those final remarks, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Panel, the problem with space exploration funding is that it's unlikely to lead us to reach new planets on a relatively short term. This is because new planets that are inhabitable are either far from Earth, and new planets that have a completely different ecosystem from Earth need a lot of adjustments to be made in order for humans to be actually able to live there. This means that you will need decades of space exploration research in order for it to actually pay off. And this is a key problem, because we don't have decades left. The Earth is if we don't stop climate change now, the Earth is going to go down in a relatively short span of years. This means the key issue here is that how we need a solution for climate change on a fairly short term. This means that we need to prioritize research into climate change over research into how do you call it? Space exploration. I'll go into more detail on our mechanism and the urgency and the comparativeness of this, but before that, I will go into a lot of rebuttal on OG. Okay, first of all, OG talks about oil lobbies. This is obviously out of the debate because the motion is this house believes that governments should fund climate change. Should fund space exploration research. In other words, we are talking about what governments should prioritize. What governments will in practice prioritize is not that important. The important thing here is if we can prove that governments should prioritize climate change research, then we prove to you that governments should not prioritize space exploration research, and then we should take it over them. So this is not a valid point of rebuttal. Secondly, a lot of stuff in their case is symmetrical. For example, the whole thing about governments can leverage ties into research and private companies don't share research, therefore research will be better. This is also true for climate change research, and this is a crucial reason for why governments should prioritize specifically climate change research, or better said, why specifically governments should prioritize climate change research. The whole thing about positive externalities from research is also completely symmetrical, because if you get positive externalities from doing research into space exploration, you're probably going to get the same things from research into climate change either way. Positive externalities from research exist for any form of research. Okay, and then they also say it's easier to sell. This is probably not true, because most people do actually believe that climate change is real. And yes, there are some people who don't believe that, but a lot more people do. There are people who don't believe that climate change is real, but there are also people who don't believe that we should fund space exploration at the point where there are starving children. I think that group is probably bigger than the group of people who don't believe in science. Therefore, I think space exploration is probably a harder sell than climate change. But there are other reasons for why specifically climate change is a better approach. It's a better approach at providing a sustainable future for humanity. Why? Because climate change research kicks in immediately. Climate change research is based. In the past few years, we have seen governments investing in climate change research, and we have seen, in fact, that some of the negative effects of climate change are getting better, but we aren't quite there. Although we aren't quite there where we want to be yet. However, the comparative on Gov side of the house, you are only going to get real effects for humanity at the point where the research is completely finalized decades later. This means that there's a bigger chance of that project failing, partially one because you don't get because it will take decades for the benefits to sit in, and again we set in, and again we don't have decades, and two, there's simply less sureness that it's going to work. If we see a project gradually succeeding, then we can expect that it will probably work. But space exploration that can either completely work or completely fail is like a Hail Mary approach. You don't have certainty if it works until like the very last minute. Therefore, we provide a more stable, more safe future for humanity, and you should vote opening opposition. Okay, so so the big change that we prove in this debate is there is a lot of technology already researching into climate change. This is also what OG mentioned, but OG also said they are going to probably cut that for space exploration. So OG cannot claim that this benefit will still exist in their side of the house. However, we can say that because this research is already there and research into space exploration is not, which OG also conceded to, this research into climate change is probably going to be a lot more effective on the short term because research have a lot more to build on. Therefore, it's also probably going to be more successful in the short term. And again, because humanity only has a few more years to succeed in combating climate change, research on the short term is incredibly vital for this to happen. Secondly, we already see that there's a switch happening to sustainable resources in the status quo, but that switch is not happening rapidly enough for it to completely succeed. Therefore, we absolutely need governments to give extra support for industries that are developing climate conscious stuff, such as solar panels or electric cars, and to make sure that people that those technologies become sustainable and economically viable as soon as possible, because at that point people will switch to that as soon as possible, and at that point people will pollute less, and therefore at that point we will at least expand. Therefore, we will stop climate change, or at least delay it. This is completely comparative because in the alternative, this funding wouldn't exist. Like I already said, OG concedes that we're going to get rid of this funding to fund their space exploration research. And secondly, government funding is finite, especially research funding, but this is probably going to. Government has a lot of fixed costs, like welfare, like the military, that we probably, and especially things like welfare, we don't want the government to cut back on. So presumably, so if this money is all coming out of some pocket of some pit for if all this money is coming out of funding for climate change, is coming up for if there is one government pot for research funding that is roughly of the same size, most of that funding should be prioritized to going to climate change instead of going to the other thing. Secondly, I think Silke also proved to you that there will be a narrative that people think, oh, climate change isn't super important because we're going to the stars anyway. Yes, in practice, that's not going to work that way, but most people who just casually read news headlines probably aren't going to realize that space exploration research takes a long time and is extremely uncertain to succeed. Therefore, because that research is so vital and because people are more likely to believe in climate change or believe in the urgency of climate change on our side of the house, we have a better chance of addressing climate change. I've already proven to you why this chance is bigger than why we have a bigger chance of preventing it than that OG has at giving an alternative by going to different planets. But even if you're only going to delay climate change, that is also good, right? Because if we delay a climate disaster, that gives humanity a few more years to survive. And furthermore, the longer humanity survives, the better the progressed our technology will be, and the better we will be, and the more chance we will have of surviving it on the long term. So for those reasons, you should vote opening opposition. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for those final remarks and I'd like to call upon the member of government to open the second half of this debate. Here.
Am I audible? A few seconds, please. Скажу, это не так сложно, как какое альтернативное топливо? Они говорили, да, уже про политику не работает. Нефть, Okay. Let me put the timer. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. In my speech, I'll elaborate a lot on framing of modern state of exploring the space. Then I'll go with why space exploration is uniquely important in the status quo and in this debate, and which impacts we will see if we do it. If we approve the motion. But before that, some points of rebuttal to open the position. They're saying that we should better do it, that we should concentrate more on the problems that we can see in our world. But however, they have zero analysis on how their researches will positively affect the state of ecology on the planet. And moreover, we believe that people actually do not really believe in, even if they really believe, they can, firstly, they may not afford some eco stuff, for example, because electric cars, for example, are very expensive. Electric stuff for household is very expensive. Not electric stuff, eco-green stuff, and so on and so forth. That's why even if you do research it a lot, it will not have a very big it will not have a very big impact because people actually cannot afford eco stuff. Moreover, we believe that the lobby that open government talked about also very important. Fossil fuel companies, car corporations, corporations like Coca-Cola that are interested in using plastics, that all companies that are interested in using cheaper materials, they all contribute into government's decisions. That's why we will always see Toyotas not on electro, but on oil. That's why this is actually not working. But we, secondly, more on finding science and finding climate change. Firstly, we believe that who actually are doing researches, maybe scientists that work for universities or laboratories and so on and so forth. We believe this funding is not being cut; it's just being reduced, but insignificantly, which mitigates strongly the case of open opposition. No, sorry. Why? Because first, who is doing funding? Government, which by devotion does not stop, but only reduces, but reduces the subsidization also, subsidizing also corporations, technological, pharmacists, etc. that are hugely interested. No, sorry, that are hugely interested in the development of science in their spheres. For example, Amazon is interested in IT, Bayern is interested in medicine, and so on and so forth. They're still interested. They will actually, they will still be finding science. Also about climate change, corporations, certain corporations can also do it in the status quo. Moreover, universities are funded by alumni associations funds that will still be interested because they will. And lastly, different NGOs that collect a lot of money, like Greenpeace, can also fund all of that if it is something important. We do not see any changes on the side of the house. Coming to framing, how does firstly redistribution of resources work? Depending on country, we have different systems of distribution. If we talk, if we take the example of ministries-based system, for example, some ministers that get certain amount of money, some ministers are actually getting certain amount of money. For example, Ministry of Education, for instance, gets $10 billion, Ministry of Science, which includes space, $10 billion, other ministries which are responsible for welfare, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, also get some kind of money, and each agency in analogies gets certain amount of money. So motion does not mean that we take all money from budget, from all ministries or all analogies of those ministries. We just take it from, we just redistribute differently the money that we the money that we spend for the Ministry of Science. No, sorry. That's why social welfare, that's why infrastructure, that's why education will never be harmed because of that, because it works so, because we are now, for example, given $2 billion from the $10 billion of Ministry of Science to space exploration. Now we're doing 8, and this is how it works. But because of the reasons that I have already explained, even science won't be harmed. Secondly, why space exploration is uniquely important? OG is going too far in the case, and Moreau talk a lot about researches, but never explain what exactly are these researches are needed for, like some magic word or something. However, we assume that it's something about looking for alternative planets, maybe that can be qualified as researchers. But we have already found new ones, about 100 exoplanets, if my memory does not let me down. That's why maybe then it is probably about maybe technologies, but as OO noted, it is hugely unrealistic case that we will develop technologies that can afford us to go to another planet. It's super expensive, it's super hard, and we need to wait for a lot of years. We believe that this motion is more about space exploration, is more about finding some alternative sources of energy, of deleting space rubbish that is around our planet, and about developing other spheres of science. How does it work? Space contains a huge amount of certain hydrogen isotope that can be used as an alternative energy, as very green energy. However, it is about it stays for something like 90% of space. However, we do not have those technologies that can afford us to get this hydrogen, and that's why we still are using fossil fuels and we still are using oil. Technologies that are less hard to be studied rather than moving to a new planet can be discovered on our side of the house when we put more money on space exploration in these terms. Also, we believe that imagine the situation when this hydrogen isotope is getting discovered from people. It made a lot of discourse, and people become interested in the space, and more, which makes people, for example, interested in alternative energy more, which makes people become interested in space rubbish more, and so on and so forth. And that's why people will demand from government to be more accurate with the space, which means that we will actually just benefit from this motion. That's why vote CG.
I thank the speaker for those final remarks. I'd like to then invite the member of opposition here.
1 minute, my dog is whining, so I'm just going to let him out of the basement. It'll take like 20 seconds.
Your dog's whining, she's gonna let him out. Hold your dog up in front of the camera.
Space sounds really exciting, but it also brings with it a lot of potential harms when you factor in the nationalist incentives that literally every country in the world ever has always had. I'm going to be doing basically one main thing for you today. I'll be doing our extension about why access to space, if we actually get it, and if we actually get these said innovations, is better via capitalism than it is via nations and nationalism. And within that, there will be like integrated refutation to OG, which I guess really is just extraneous because I'm going to start with it. So I think the first thing to note is that we think that actually finding things in space is probably not very likely, or like having huge innovations, i.e. finding a planet B is probably not extremely likely, considering that we've already explored the entirety of our solar system, haven't found anything, been working for decades, and have not actually made that much progress. But even if you do buy that we will discover planet B, the logistics of transferring 9 billion people to a planet millions, even billions of light years away sounds really, really unfeasible, and probably will cost a sum of money that no government even has, or even the entirety of the world even has. That might be hyperbole, but I just think the logistics are huge, and the crisis that is looming probably isn't going to facilitate that. Secondly, they talked to you about scientific innovations. Scientific labs have also had a lot of innovations, which means that oftentimes they can simulate the conditions of space, and so they can do a lot of the experiments that they talk about on Earth without having to get in a fancy rocket ship. Thus, we think that OG's case, to an extent, is largely moot. However, we can win this debate because we will take both OG and CG, because a lot of what they said was extending on OG at its best, and prove to you why even if we do get these quote-unquote innovations or a very, very highly unlikely discovery of planet B, why it is actually bad for the world. All right, actually maybe not planet B, but that's pretty much zero, so not in this debate really. All right, so let's get into the actual extension about the access to space is better via capitalism than nationalism. Before I get into the meat of the analysis, I think we have to analyze the incentive of both corporations and private incentives, because I think it's well established now that corporations are going to be in this. We've already seen this in terms of SpaceX, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. They're all all the rich white men really want to get into space, so I think it's something that we're going to continue to see, and it's their pet projects. But private corporations corporations very much just have the incentive to make the most money possible. That's very intuitive. But nations have the incentive to serve their people because these are the people that are going to get them elected. But note that we think like that this doesn't necessarily mean that they want to collaborate with other countries. Why? Because we think that like if you find something, you want it all for your own people and you want your own people to benefit as opposed to like the entire world, because then it gives your own people comparative advantage. But we just don't think that geopolitics facilitate people like collaborating, because there's only a few countries which realistically are going to have the capacity to pour the large amounts of money needed to actually get real innovation in space. So like China, Russia, the EU, and US. Currently, the US has Trump, which makes him kind of unpopular with the rest of the world. China is also unpopular with the rest of the world, except for Russia, where Russia is kind of dependent on them. And the EU, like, I don't know, is kind of there, but not really, doesn't really like China, Russia, or the US right now. So I think what this means is that countries don't really want to collaborate right now, but even if they do, there's no way that you're going to get the entire world collaborating. So best case scenario, you have lots. But note that we actually think that really it's only China and the USA which have been making huge innovations likely, and they both hate each other's guts. So probably not going to happen. But note, all right, but what does this mean if you don't have collaborations? Or like rather, even if you have collaborations, there's always going to be a dominant partner because there will be someone investing more money who can likely capitalize on that innovation more. But what does this mean if you don't actually have collaboration? I mean that you have the incentive to monopolize whatever you discover in space if you do discover it for your own citizens, because you spent all this money in space because like you had to take it from other services. So thus you want your citizens to actually reap the rewards and for them to be happy that you discovered it and probably re-elect you into office. But what does this mean? We are, or rather like, so we think like, for example, if you discover a new cache of diamonds, you're probably only going to want like your own citizens to like access it. Or if you discover some like huge new innovation, only your citizens can access it. Or if you discover like planet B, which is great, probably you'll only want your citizens to have it. Because if you are the US, you discover this new innovation or you discover a planet B, are your citizens going to be happy if you let the Chinese go to planet B? Probably not. And we think that's unfortunate, but it's unfortunately a lot of what is happening in our world. But why is this bad? We think there are several reasons why this is bad. Firstly, we think like you don't get to choose, but first let me explain. We think like corporations, because they just want to make money, aren't tied by these incentives, so they're probably just going to sell it to whatever governments have the money, which is pretty much all of the governments because they're all developed. So thus you don't get like this like whole like they don't want to share it with other people. But why is this bad? Firstly, like you don't get to choose what country you're born in, like the lottery of birth argument. I didn't get to choose to be born in Canada. I don't know. Cveta didn't get to choose to be born somewhere in Eastern Europe. So thus we think it's bad if you're denied access to innovations which could potentially really help you, or denied access to a planet B simply because of the fact that you live in a country which did not discover it. However, we think that with corporations in the scope of this debate, like facilitate less of this lottery of birth because of the fact that they will just sell it to the countries that will pay the money, and the countries can thus provide access to the citizens, so you get less of this principled justification. But secondly, we think that there is the case tensions might rise. Why? Because if you see that other countries have something that you don't, and your government literally poured millions, maybe even billions of dollars into space research, are you going to be happy? No, because that money couldn't have been put into your healthcare or your son's education, and you're probably going to be quite mad that these people have something that you don't, despite the fact that they spent so much money. So what does this mean? We think firstly, citizens are more likely to have subconscious biases towards people within them. It's protected time. So we think that it means things like they're going to treat them worse, make their quality of life worse. But secondly, we think that it's more likely for government to have protectionist policies and less collaborative policies, because are you going to want to trade with people, or are you going to want to like trade with the country that now has this huge leg up over the rest of the world, or that you hate because they now actually got to discover an innovation? You're probably going to be less likely to want to do this. So we think governments are thus less likely to want to like trade with them or engage in collaboration in other facets. We think that collaboration is often good, and trade in developing countries, or developed countries rather, is often good because you can get things like a comparative advantage, and you can like get goods for cheaper, which benefits a lot of citizens. But lastly, we think it also just does things like it gives countries unnecessary political influence, i.e. China is now more able to bully the countries in Africa to ally with it as opposed to other countries, because now it has this huge advantage where in all other cases it might have been better for them to ally it with the US. If tech companies just sell it to whoever will get it, i.e. both countries, we think that you are thus like able to have countries ally with who is best for them. For all those reasons, we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
thank the speaker for those final remarks. I'd like then to call upon the government move to close debate for Gov side. Here.
Okay. So I'm going to start in 1, 2, 3. Two things in the speech. Firstly, why specifically the extension that we brought to you in this debate and the impact of it is like the most important part of this debate. And secondly, I'll just prove why on the comparative we win this debate. And firstly, I'll just elaborate more on what my partner has brought to you in his extension. I think OG has tried like to tell about the importance of the research without actually telling how specifically it will and uniquely will like affect the life of the people directly, because there are a number of ways under which the exploration of the space does affect you. For example, for example, under space exploration, you can study the reaction of your body to the certain chemicals. You can it would directly affect the chemistry. It would directly affect some biological stuff, and it will be huge boost for this science. Secondly, there are a number of like alternative fossil fuels like isotope and hydrogen. They're very cheap, and they can be like a potential alternative for because they eco green, and they like in the nearest future they can be somehow potential for this. Therefore, it affects in the number of ways. And moreover, it will affect the directed life of those people, because at the point at which you will find some specific amendments, for example, in the body, it can affect the future research. It can affect the curing or the curing of some diseases, or just it will lead to better equipment. Sorry, I will take later. And just overall, it will improve the life of the people. We believe that this is the hugest impact in this debate, given the comparative I will now make, because what essentially firstly like what CO brings to us. Firstly about like general commentary on their case that countries don't want to collaborate. I generally question the impacts of this, because at the point at which they do, for example, like in the worst case scenario, when they don't want to collaborate, it essentially will lead to more competition inside this space area. Why this is important? Because it essentially means that that those countries would try to have more innovation, like in a space. Like in a space race, they're more likely to invest this, and that specifically proves why this specifically proves why we're very likely to succeed, because now at the point at which there will be more research, there will be more innovations, there will be more money put it, more professors will be like engaged in those activities. It is very likely to like increase the competition. But moreover, on their specific impact, that the like countries will save this innovations for them. I also question whether this impact is bad, because at least people living inside those countries will have some solution, or will have some technology working in their country, because not please that the comparative here is that they don't have this technology because they don't want, because they do not innovate in the space exploration. The nearest comparative for them is that there will be some research done. There will be some research done, because but due to the fact that they have no analysis on why their research will succeed, I believe they lose. I believe that they lose at that point. Moreover, moreover, on the opening opposition, firstly, Firstly, Galymzhan already have hugely mitigated the case of the opening opposition at the point at which first he showed the way economic redistribution works in those countries, that there are some certain ministries, and it will not hugely affect other ministries such as healthcare. But secondly, he also showed you that it is very unlikely that it is very unlikely that other sciences will suffer to such a big extent that they won't be able to protest any research in the climate change inside Earth. Yes, inside Earth, I think that it hugely mitigates their case. But moreover, the only response they give to the alternative, like to the rebuttal to the alternative, that there is some oil companies, there are some other corporations who lobby for that governments, like it is in the option that the government should prioritize, even if government will prioritize climate change like exploration and more research. In that, my partner essentially shows to you that there are certain obstacles and problems under which government cannot operate. What it essentially means that even if they will prioritize those, it is very unlikely that they will have like that they can change something inside their countries. On the comparative, given that given that like in the space, it is much more easier to solve those issues. For example, you can just like clean the rubbish near the Earth, which makes the ozone layer like worse, or just you can make more research because there is no such thing as corporations putting some obstacles inside it. But even if they do exist, they just only sell, and yes, they just only will say to you those innovations, which I believe is great. Like, but moreover, yes, moreover, as soon as the problem in the space is detected, it is more easy to make those researches. It is more easier to elaborate on that specific discourse, and at the point at which they tell us that less people will be engaged, I think it works conversely, because in the status quo, space is acquiring a lot of attention. Look at like Elon Musk and some other stuff. So what we have brought to you in this debate, we firstly showed to you why specifically we have the hugest impact in this debate, why it will affect some specific lives. Well, yes, it will affect specific lives. And Kosmozana Boncha, vote CG, please.
I thank the speaker for those final remarks. And finally, I'd like to invite the opposition whip here.
Thank you. Can I just take 1 second to organize my notes and I'll get started. I also just take 1 minute to tell my grandma to not interrupt me, because otherwise she will come in and try to feed me.
Now that all these things are streamed.
So sorry. Okay. The core of our case is that your money is just as good no matter if you're Chinese, Russian, or American. Look, the comparative here is as follows. It's whether the private sector should explore space, or whether space exploration should be a mix of private and public. Julia tells you that we will probably not find planet B. So just finding a different planet to which we can move is going to be very challenging and would create truly enormous problems. Firstly, because there's hard limits of the speed with which we can travel. And secondly, there's also hard limits of the way we can exist. Like, we can't just all live in Among Us spacesuits on spaceships traveling, ejecting people out of portholes. Like, we need science to back us up. And right now the science says we can't just move to Mars or Venus, and finding a planet where we can move to is going to be really hard. So what is this debate actually about? It's probably about discovering new technologies and materials that are applicable in industry, healthcare, basically things that could improve our lives significantly. Who will be better at doing this? How will this look like? Why do we think it's going to be better on our side? So firstly, we tell you that the private sector is probably going to be better at doing this for a few reasons. Firstly, they're probably going to have a lot more money because each individual country is going to be able to devote a much smaller portion to space exploration than what Jeff Bezos is. Also, I'm going to tell you a little bit later, while collaboration is unlikely to be important and significant. Secondly, when it is a mix of private and public, they will always be able to outspend on salaries and talent if they're competing with governments for a few reasons. Firstly, because they are not subject to the bureaucratic quagmire of telling, this is how we spend all of your money. This is why we're paying this person this much. Governments often have hard limits on how much they can pay people. And it's going to be extremely politically unpopular for you to attract a really, really new talent by giving them an enormous salary. Jeff Bezos doesn't have that problem. He can just throw money at a problem until it goes away. Secondly, competition and fast moving, like you can hire and fire people a lot easier in the private sector. Next, like you don't have to go through all the red tape. And lastly, just like these people are going to be doing it anyway. Forcing them out of the market is going to be incredibly difficult. So you're always going to have to be competing with them. So I think that probably the public sector is not going to be as good at it. So the worst case scenario of this is that you just funnel money into private companies like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos with little accountability to taxpayers. So next thing I want to talk about, countries will not collaborate in the same way that they do. This will likely lead to nationalistic tendencies that are coming out and actually countries monopolizing important things. This is the bulk of Julie's extension. Why is this true? Firstly, you're investing a lot of money and you're hoping to get really big returns. And importantly, this is taxpayers' money. This is your hard-earned America dollars that you're earned with your hard-earned American work, right? We don't want to give it to the mean Russians. We don't want to share it. This is like a really big problem, especially because we're having an enormous protectionist swing. Like the pendulum of protectionism versus globalism is often swinging and we don't know where it's going to fall. So right now, the best case scenario you have is you're going to have blocks, and that's not great because if you're starting a new Iron Curtain, that's probably not great. Like even if it doesn't get to that point, it's probably bad if countries probably won't collaborate. But importantly, because countries are going to want to keep discoveries for their own citizens because of democratic pressures, and also because it confers an enormous political advantage, it can genuinely change the global balance. Look, I don't know what new material is going to be found, but think about an analogous example with the COVID vaccine. The COVID vaccine right now, if the Russian government were to discover it, they would say, look, we're going to give it to our Russian citizens first, and if you want it, you're going to have to make enormous concessions to us. And we don't even know what discoveries can be found in space. It could be more significant than the COVID vaccine, and when national governments are protecting nationally, that's a really big problem. Like this is completely different to private enterprise. And what's different about a private enterprise discovering these things, right? Firstly, you're not going to upset the balance of power in incredibly unpredictable ways. Secondly, everybody's money is equally good to a corporation. It doesn't matter if you're Russian, it doesn't matter if you're gay, as long as you can pay for it, they will do it. And it's really important to note that no matter what, the most privileged are going to be benefiting from this first, even if governments are the ones investing, because it's just going to be cost prohibitive to provide everything to everyone. So like at least when it's not constrained nationally, governments can fund citizens who need the sorts of discoveries that you can give. Governments can help citizens do this, and governments can like pressure corporations. Secondly, you can earn lots by selling to lots of small countries rather than to just one, so it's probably not going to be monopolized by one country. Lastly, private enterprise can be regulated and legislated significantly better. You can make private citizens do things in ways that you cannot make countries do. If Jeff Bezos discovers something really important, we can probably force him to share at least a lot of it rather than like forcing Russia to share a lot of it. So the next thing I want to do is just do a bunch of rebuttal. Firstly, we get told governments aren't going to, the first thing I want to talk about is where is this money going to come from? Why are governments going to spend money on welfare instead? Because apparently this seems to be a problem on top half. CG says you will never harm the funding from important areas because they're siloed off. And OG says, but people don't care about healthcare. So like, it's okay if they take money out of healthcare. Basically, OG says like, nobody's going to spend money on important stuff anyway. two things. Firstly, budgets change, like nothing is ever set in stone. You can change the proportion of money that actually goes to education and healthcare. Secondly, healthcare probably isn't the problem here. The problem here is that people who are politically underrepresented, do not have a political voice, will have their programs cut because that's the easiest place to cut them. Lobbying groups aren't going to allow you to cut it from areas like oil funding because you need to be reelected as a decision maker. And oftentimes lobbying groups are the only way you can do that. So the things that are going to get cut are probably after school programs for low-income kids, unemployment benefits, prisoners' welfare, single mothers, immigration support and services, all things you can point to and say, these people don't really deserve that much money. And look at all the great things you're going to get from space. This has happened before. We know it happens. Next, so it's also really important that to note that it's probably interesting to say that it is a morally okay thing to sacrifice living, breathing people who are alive today to benefit potentially their children, but also definitely benefiting the wealthy who are going to benefit in the meantime. So I think that's a really, really big problem. So panel. Also, just one last thing on rebuttal. Like this thing with collateral benefits, I think is pretty much solved with the comparison we give you because like you're going to have the collateral benefits and also you could probably get the collateral benefits a lot easier if you actually research for the collateral benefits. If you're like, how can we increase people growing in space rather than just sending people to space and what happens? So I think that like top half and the other side doesn't really work. But like it's for all these reasons. Yes, us.
I thank the speaker for those final remarks and everyone for what was an enjoyable debate. Please virtually shake hands and then enjoy your afternoon. We're going to adjudicate this, I believe, in this particular Zoom call. Am I right?
I mean, assuming they stop the streaming,